Welcome to this SIAM webinar by EXIN. Today I'm with Michelle Major-Goldsmith and Simon Dorst. My name is Simone van Zuiden and I will be your host. The webinar today will be about how to make SIAM easy. The recent publication of both the SIAM Foundation and Professional Bodies of Knowledge has led to an increased interest in understanding on how to do it, the practical considerations for moving to a SIAM-based model. In this webinar, SIAM Lead Architects Simon Dorst and Michelle Major-Goldsmith will provide some vital information regarding making a move to a SIAM model. Note, you are all on mute. You can ask questions using the chat function or the questions function throughout the webinar. At the end, all questions will be addressed. The webinar will be recorded. You will receive the recording of this webinar later this week. Enjoy the webinar. The floor is yours, Michelle and Simon.
Thanks, Simona. Welcome all. As Simona's already said, I'm Michelle Major-Goldsmith, and with me today is my colleague Simon Dorst. We're both from Kinetic IT in Australia. We work in a department called Service Management Services. Simone's alluded to the fact that we've recently finished the mammoth task of collating the SIAM professional body of knowledge, which has now been published through Van Haren Publishing. And we thought we'd use this opportunity to share some of the findings from the body of knowledge, which hopefully give you a further, more practical understanding of SIAM and how it might be useful for you and your organisations. So the plan today is we're going to take you through what is SIAM, what is the SIAM roadmap, what is each stage of the roadmap and what's happening, and we're going to try to give you some good and bad style examples of various implementation approaches that we've experienced, and we're going to try to share with you some of the ideas and the potential pitfalls. As we go through the session, Simona will watch the comments and pick up any questions you might pose. But of course, if you want to have a conversation with either of us offline, then please do get in touch. Probably easiest directly via Twitter, and we can talk to you via that. Our Twitter handles are on the slide here. So if I hand over now to Simon, he's going to kick things off.
All right, thanks, Michelle. To start off, a few of the wild stories out there regarding SIAM, which was actually one of the reasons why many years ago we started into writing blogs and white papers around it. A couple of years ago, the Foundation, and just recently, the SIAM Professional Body of Knowledge. We want to present SIAM as a coherent framework, making sure that people understand what it is and how to use it. Just as an aside, there are many discussions about frameworks or practices or methodologies or approaches, and whilst it can be highly entertaining to talk about them, we'll just use either or the other without hopefully offending anyone. But if you do want to have an offline conversation about it, I'm quite happy to do it. So let's first establish that SIAM is not the former name of Thailand. Well, it is, but that's not really what we're talking about. We are talking about service integration and management. And it's very important to realize that it's not a silver bullet. It's not something that will solve all your issues. You know, the issues you've been trying to solve with ITIL for decades, that didn't work. Then you thought DevOps would solve all your issues. That didn't work. And now you're looking for something else and you think SIAM it is. No, it's not the next best thing. In fact, SIAM doesn't even replace ITIL or some of the other frameworks. There are a lot of similarities and overlaps in the basic principles of both ITIL and SIAM, but then again, basic service management is based on common sense, so there must be some overlap in there. But SIAM is not meant to replace ITIL, to take over where you left it or where it didn't work or where you think it's old hat. It's not a choice between ITIL or SIAM and any other practice around it. SIAM is unique in offering a structure for you, a culture, principles and practices for managing multi-service provider environments and allowing choice within that. In fact, we actually encourage that because different providers in the framework will use their different practices. And finally, SIAM is not a fad. It's not something that those consultants have came up to sell some books, training and consulting. Of course, I would say that because I am one of those consultants, but SIAM has been around since the early 2000s, And so there's a treasure trove of tried and tested practices out there for you to apply SIAM within your organization. And that's what we want to talk about a little bit more. So what SIAM is kind of harks back to a white paper that we wrote back a while ago, and we coined a phrase that SIAM is an evolution of how to apply a framework for integrated service management across multiple service providers. It's developed for many organizations that moving away from a single supplier outsourcer to having multiple service providers with a lot of complexity. And SIAM has evolved to address the challenges that those complex environments are offering you. So it is responding to these multi-sourcing environments by adding functional elements that you often don't find in the other practices and governance structures that support them. It's cross-functional, cross-process, cross-provider integration. And one of the elements in here is that collaboration and the end-to-end focus are at the basis and the core of a SIAM model, the culture, and the working practices that you have to apply within a SIAM ecosystem. So it adds a functional or structural or organizational element to it with necessary functions to manage relationships and contracts with various providers and consumers. And that's what makes it quite unique, because it involves the control and the input across all those value networks necessary across many different suppliers, each with their own intake onto service delivery in there. And finally, SIAM is a shift in the skill set that people need. There's less technology these days in IT, but the information part, the I, has become more complex and more important. So a modern day professional will be working in an environment with a multifunctional team, dealing with multiple providers, having horizontal layering, vertical silos, consumers expecting it to just work, and customers looking for agility and stability. These are environments where SIAM skills are necessary. And with the complexity of those cross-functional, cross-organizational teams, soft skills such as negotiation and influencing are important too, as well as a more commercial awareness. And the wish for teams to have a one-team culture, a one-team focus, is something that needs to be educated and developed and cannot be simply controlled and coerced.
So following on from Simon, let me explain how a SIAM model might look. I'm sure many of you have seen this before, and we wanted to keep it really quite simple. We believe that there should be 3 layers in a SIAM ecosystem. The first is the customer organization, you can see at the top there. The second is the layer of the service integration that Simon referred to, that sort of functional structure. And the third is the service providers. Each layer actually has a key role in terms of the effective end-to-end management of services and the delivery of the maximum value, which is what the customer's looking for. And each layer really has to have sufficient capability and maturity to fulfill its role and obligations. So if I call you back to the top of the slide, you can see the customer organisation, sometimes referred to as the commissioning organisation, is the end client, the one that's making the transition to a SIAM ecosystem as part of its operating model. It actually commissions the SIAM ecosystem based on its strategic focus. Now, the customer organisation will own the contractual relationships with the external service providers and, of course, any external integrator. And that's an important point because the customer needs to be free to choose the providers that they feel is going to add value within their ecosystem. Now, you can see at the top there, we've talked about the customer organisation having some retained capabilities. Now, these can be different depending on the organisation, but they tend to be functions that are responsible for strategic, architectural, business engagement, and corporate governance type functions. Retained capabilities are sometimes what we refer to as the intelligent client function. I often refer to them as the crown jewels. They're things that the customer organisation wants to keep close to their chest. These business differentiating functions remain under the control and ownership of the customer and include accountabilities and responsibilities that might also remain with the customer, perhaps for legislative or regulatory reasons. So here I'm thinking about areas like enterprise architecture, procurement, contract management, financial and commercial management, managing a portfolio, and things like corporate risk. So if we move into that second layer, this is the SIAM ecosystem and where the end-to-end service governance, management, integration, assurance, and coordination is performed. Now, they're key SIAM functions. The service integrator layer focuses on implementing that effective cross-service provider organisation that Simon alluded to. And really, it's about making sure that all the service providers are contributing to that end-to-end service. It provides the organisational governance over the service providers, and it has a direct relationship with the customer organisation and the service providers. Now, the service integrator is independent from the retained capabilities within the customer layer, even if it is internally focused or internally sourced, so it's part of the customer organisation. Now, when we look at this SIAM ecosystem, there's a number of different ways that we can actually really frame our integration model or layer. So 4 options that we focus on, and there may be more, are the externally sourced layer, the internally sourced, the hybrid, or the lead supplier. So these are 4 different ways of doing service integration. If we think about externally sourced, this is the structure where the customer appoints an external organisation to take on the role and provide the capabilities of the service integrator. The externally sourced integrator is exclusively focused on service integration activities, and it doesn't do any of the other service provider type roles. The internally sourced model within the SIAM structure is where the customer organisation takes on the role of the service integrator themselves because they have capability perhaps to do that. And the customer role, though, even if that does happen, it does need to be defined and managed separately. We use the term impartiality. So even if the customer organisation takes on the role of integration, they need to be seen as completely impartial from anything else that they do. The third structure that we propose is the hybrid. So it's almost a culmination of both of the first 2. So the customer is collaborating with an external organisation to take on the role of the integrator and provide that integration capability. The hybrid integrator, though, again, is exclusively focused on service integration activities and wouldn't take on any of the other provider roles. And finally, at the bottom of sort of one that's quite common is what we refer to as a lead supplier. So in this structure, the role of the service integrator is taken on by an external organisation that is also a provider, and you can see the providers down on that bottom layer there. Now, the reason for selecting a structure like this are similar to those of selecting an external integrator. It's probably suitable for customers who have an existing relationship with a provider who has integration capabilities, because there's almost a degree of trust which is already born or fostered there. Now, note here that the service integrator has absolutely no contractual relationship with the service providers, and that's important. The integrator is independent from those contractual relationships. Their role is to provide the end-to-end integration, and that actually needs impartiality. So our customer organisation is going to choose one of those structures based on all kinds of factors. They're going to look at their internal capabilities. Can they do service integration, their own maturity, their resources and their skills. They're going to look at their own complexity in terms of the services that are offered. And then they might look out to things like legislative or regulatory requirements and their appetite for external sourcing and so on. So of our layers, I've mentioned the customer organisation at the top with their retained capabilities, the integrator layer where we've got the 4 structures that are proposed, and then we've got the final layer, and you can see that at the bottom, that's our service providers. Now, important for me is that I said the word providers, not suppliers, not vendors, and certainly not towers, which is a bit of an old school definition. So within a service ecosystem or SIAM ecosystem, there are going to be multiple service providers, each one responsible for delivering one or more of the service or service elements. The service providers are responsible for managing the products and the technology used to deliver its contracted or agreed services, and they're going to operate their own processes. Now, I've mentioned the term tower. It's a pretty old school service integration term, but for me, I don't like it because it implies isolation, it implies a sort of monolithic approach. So the term provider is what we prefer, because it also gives us the ability to cover off those internal service providers who really need to be treated in exactly the same way within the SIAM ecosystem. So as I've said, the providers can be part of the customer or they can be external to it. So think of things like your desktop services or your end user computing, your networks, your cloud services, your application development and support and maintenance, and so on. They're all examples, I guess, of the providers that can be within that layer.
Well, before we go into the more practical application of SIAM, it's probably good to have a little bit of a history around it. And maybe even before that, because if you look at ITIL, it traditionally started from within, from the perspective of the IT department. And then in the 90s, we had outsourcing and back to core business, but that was mainly large service integrator, those single outsourcers in there. And then in the noughties, which by the way is a great name for a decade, we have internet and integration of applications and IT. And these days, we have everything as a service. We've got digital revolution and Internet of Things, and IT has become integral with the business, but it's more complex than ever. And so SIAM has almost become the new black. It's very high on the hype curve in there, but really, service integration and management, or the concept of SIAM, actually originated around 2005 within the UK public sector. And in 2010, they published a new information and communication technology strategy, including moving away from large prime supplier contracts and having a more flexible approach to using multiple service providers. But it took basically until 2016 to really have a single foundation body of knowledge describing what SIAM was all about. Until then, SIAM, maybe not dissimilar to like Agile and DevOps, didn't really have a clear singular description, accreditation of methodology. So in 2016, which you can see towards the bottom of the slide, the Foundation Architect Group was formed, and in the latter part of that year, we released the foundation body of knowledge and some process guides. And then last year, going on from there, we collated the professional body of knowledge around SIAM, giving a more in-depth view of the SIAM concept, but also some really practical guidance. And if we have a quick look, this little table is showing the origin of the body of knowledge downloads, which demonstrates that there are some really service-orientated nations in there. If you look at Japan at number 2, or Finland in the top 10, or Netherlands for that matter, being relatively small countries, Australia as well. But also you can see the global reach that this SIAM concept has, which is really encouraging to see.
Okay, so as promised, Sam moves into the next slide. We wanted to talk about this idea of a SIAM implementation roadmap. That's basically our example plan for how you would implement SIAM as part of your organization's operating model. The use of a roadmap we feel is a good idea because it's got really some sensible benefits. It gives you the ability to define your requirements for SIAM for your own organization. It gives you an opportunity to provide a planning framework, so we're not just making it up as we go along. It's about helping an organization to determine the most appropriate SIAM structure within their SIAM model. It helps us to guide our implementation, which is a good idea. It also gives us the ability to set up robust organizational change management. And let's be clear here, a move to a SIAM ecosystem can be quite challenging, so organizational change management is absolutely key. And then, of course, thinking about that ongoing continual improvement. So above and beyond implementation, what are we going to do to make it bigger, faster, cheaper, higher, stronger? So as the slide says here, our SIAM roadmap has 4 stages. Now, there may well be reiteration through the stages. It might not be in a linear model. It depends how well your journey goes. But the 4 stages are, first of all, discovery and strategy. And this is where the basis for the SIAM model is investigated, which leads to plan and build, and where we're going into more detailed considerations. And then, of course, into implement, so our approach to implementation, big bang, or a series of subsequent phases, until you get to run and improve, which is really about keeping the lights on. It's where the operational model is working, it's where it's running and being fine-tuned. Now, we want to go through each of these stages and highlight for you some of the key activities and the outputs before giving you some good and bad examples that we've got from the body of knowledge and from the research and information that came from the SIAM authors. So if I move into discovery and strategy, this is the first stage. It's the area which it needs substantial investment, and I mean in terms of time and capability from the customer. If the capability doesn't exist, then the organisation might need to look to an advisory organisation that does have SIAM skills, so that they can design their design model with a consultant that understands how the model should work and how we can have that separation of concerns. Now, that's important, because if your consulting organisation is also going to be part of your SIAM ecosystem, you need to make sure that their advisory arms and their operating arms are very, very distinct because of the impartiality I mentioned before. Now, what we want to do is make sure that if an organisation is acting as an advisor, it doesn't look as if they have influence or a head start on the SIAM design. But I'm going to come to impartiality later. This is just an option for an organisation to consider if they don't have much knowledge of SIAM or some SIAM skills in-house. So if you think about what SIAM is looking at and customers are looking at, customers are wanting SIAM to help them to respond to changing needs. There's lots of new providers out there. They want to get benefit from those economic specialisms and the capabilities of the plethora of the providers that are available, but they don't want the risks and costs and the complexity associated with those services. So the customer's looking for the benefits and expertise that the providers can bring, but the complexity and risks associated often outweighs that, which is why moving to SIAM in a well-conceived way with the proper strategy and design can be quite useful. So first and foremost, I want to be clear that the customer organisation has to have clear objectives about the value that SIAM is going to bring for them. They need to define their policies and strategies, and they need to really work out what their delivery challenges are and why they might want to move to a SIAM model. The discovery and strategy stage includes the initiation of the transformation project for SIAM, and let's be clear, it needs to be a project. It's not something we can do as part of a day job. So having a project means that the organisation can determine what it needs to do, what it needs to source internally, what skills and resources it requires, what it would like to source externally, and it also needs to understand the benefits of SIAM from its own point of view. So what if its own particular drivers for moving to that model? So within this discovery and strategy stage, we've got this high-level transformation project. We've got a governance framework stated at a high level. We've got an analysis of the current state of the organisation, looking at its skills and the providers and tools and processes, and also an outward look at what's available in the marketplace in terms of potential service providers and integrators. So what this actually creates is the ability to start to contribute to an outline business case to move to a SIAM model, where some of the more high-level decisions regarding how services will be sourced and what type of providers will be worked with under that model have actually been thought about.
So the nice thing about the professional body of knowledge, the SIAM professional body of knowledge, is that it contains a lot of examples of good and bad practices, and we want to share some of them, and I will start off with the good practices regarding the discovery and strategy stage. So very important, as Michelle said, that we can't do this strategy without knowing what is possible, which is kind of the looking out, but also without knowing what our internal capabilities are, looking in. So there's a lot of effort involved in there. And if you don't invest in the discovery and strategy of your SIAM model, that will ultimately have an impact on the later design and the running and delivery of it. And what we can see is that a lot of customers want SIAM, do not really know what it is. And it's not just end-to-end service management that some people think it is. It's just service management across multiple providers. People don't apply the correct planning, and they don't apply a proper project around it. They are not clear about their objectives or the value of what they think they can achieve out of a SIAM thing in there. And without those unclear policies and strategies, it's going to be really difficult for a service integrator and the service provider to truly deliver that value to the business in there. So the value is a difficult thing. It is often intangible. It is often complex. It is about how we define and provision and control the different service elements. And that means we need to start with a SIAM strategy, which is not easy. So one of the examples of the professional body of knowledge is a UK public sector organisation who choose to start an open discussion approach to grow their own understanding of SIAM and the benefits. So they invited a number of potential commercial external service integrators to attend the meeting, and with them had an open discussion about the service integrator marketplace and the objectives and the value that the business could achieve. So in this meeting, the customer provided information around their services and their capabilities, and the various integrators offered their view and advice in this meeting. So this wasn't a tender of anything out there about what could be done and what could be appropriate. And that really helped the customer to set their strategy before going out to tender and actually appointing one of them. Another point to look at here is possibly enterprise architecture. As I said, SIAM does envelop and use other practices and frameworks in there. So having an enterprise architecture framework from that customer retained layer is really important, because without this, you will control less what providers and the integrator are doing in there. So an enterprise architecture framework allows for making those systemic design decisions and then allow those long-term decisions to filter through design requirements and support in there. Michelle, you have some bad examples?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the flip side, one bad practice in this stage is, and I've mentioned it before, failing to run the move to a SIAM model as a project or program. So it's a substantial project. It's really big, and that means changing the way we work, the processes, the attitude, the behaviours and the culture. And that's before you even start to think about contracts and functions and teams and responsibilities. So none of this should be underestimated in terms of time and cost and effort and resources involved. Of course, there are a variety of project methods and standards out there, for example, PMI or PMBOK or Prince2. And combining these with any other practices within an organisation can give you a really good starting point for managing a SIAM transition project. Also consider that sort of zero to hero transformation to a SIAM model. It may take considerable time. So if you've got existing legacy contracts and other business initiatives that are pressing, it's not necessarily the case that you can move to SIAM quickly. The transformation program might take some time. So think about your organisation, think about your specific environment and your strategy. And in particular, you know, Simon mentioned before, when involving external advisors, that can be a good thing, but it also has to be something you do quite carefully. One of the examples within the book talks about an organisation that brought in external consultants who essentially reused a SIAM model that had previously been created for a much larger multinational organisation. And because this was their model that they were used to, they implemented this in the organisation. And for the customer, they actually found there was a threefold increase in the costs associated with the service. So they weren't terribly happy about their new SIAM ecosystem. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'd say is, you know, we also talk about in projects check for benefits. So you've got a considerable investment there, and benefits realisation management absolutely has to follow. So quite often, because the SIAM model evolves and it's continual and it's not something we can do straight away, we don't necessarily always do that review and check and get clarity around, has the commissioning organisation or the customer actually have value from that new system? Now, look, this is not unique to SIAM. Quite often we hear people complaining about practices they've used, that doesn't work, or it's an overhead, or worse still, the model is not accepted. So what we need to do is really have clarity. And I talked before about doing the baseline and understanding where we are before we embark on our journey. And then once we have evolved our SIAM ecosystem and we have it in place, we make sure that we do that benefits realization review.
Okay, so after this discovery and strategy stage, the next stage in the roadmap is plan and build. Sorry, the slides will update in a moment, a little bit of delay there. So this stage we do after we have that outline business case and an outline of the model in there. And this is the stage where we get more detail in and working in, focusing on completing the design and creating the plans for the transformation to the SIAM model. So that can be an iterative way where you start designing a little bit of detail, maybe run it past the potential service integrator, and then provide more specific decisions around it. It includes concepts of modularity and loose coupling, where we basically try to design a SIAM model where we can easily decouple an underperforming redundant service provider, which is something that seems to be quite important for the C-suite, and with good reason, because each provider is a module in the delivery model, and when we can have an easily swap-in modification or replacement of the service providers, it provides a flexibility to the SIAM model that is quite welcome in this day and age. But it also allows a quick addition of new services and maybe things like innovation, and also allows a model where we can reduce perhaps some of the shadow IT that exists in organizations where business units are engaging with service providers outside of the IT control. And a SIAM model should provide a more flexible structure to allow businesses to engage with different providers, but still have it in a central governance model in there. So within the plan and build stage, all the plans and approvals are put in place before we start on the implement side. So let's see if we can have some good and bad examples here as well.
Okay, so Simon said there's so much going on here. So designing everything from the SIAM model, the governance framework, the process models, the technology roadmap, and all of this accounts for change. So it's a big deal. And one of the things, and I get quite preachy about this, is a focus on organizational change management. So establishing and running a transition to SIAM really needs you to embrace industry models like ADKAR, which gives you the opportunity to think about how you're going to manage the people side of change, because there's a lot happening here. For those of you that are not aware, ADKAR stands for awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. And it's really about making sure that we take people on that journey to reinforce what we're trying to achieve and make sure that they're along for the ride. So that ADKAR acronym I've just mentioned represents 5 milestones that an individual needs to embrace in order to be successful in a change. The first one is awareness. So this is about getting people to understand why we're going to do it, reflecting on the what's in it for me. And that's actually quite difficult, especially if the change is considerable. It's going to impact their job. Desire is the next stage, and again, that's hard to achieve because this is where you get the individual to accept and embrace the change. And again, going back to what I said, if it's not going to be necessarily in somebody's best interest, getting them to have desire for the change can be a challenging thing to do. But desire can be sort of built up by trying to explain some of the factors that will add benefit to the individual. Knowledge is where we get an individual to understand how to implement a change. So this might be giving them education or skills or changing their behaviours, often through things like training and coaching. Ability is one stage after knowledge because you can train somebody and give them knowledge, but ability is where they feel able to deliver the changes against what the organisation is hoping to achieve. So think coaching and practice and time. The last one is reinforcement. So making sure that the new ways of working become embedded. We don't want people to sort of slip down to the old ways of working. So reinforcement is where we get, the organisation and the people within it to really understand and to measure what they do and recognise the success of making a change. For any change to be implemented and sustained, an individual really needs to go through each of those milestones, starting with that whole awareness and building the awareness. So have a look at industry techniques like ADCAR to help you. Another important point that we labour on, I guess, in the body of knowledge is around collaboration models. So lots of people tell us, we haven't got SIAM-based contracts and we can't move to them straight away. Think about collaboration models and techniques. Now, they're not artifacts or templates, but it's actually about getting people to understand their overall view, part of the bigger picture in the end-to-end service delivery. So the objectives of collaboration models are getting providers to look at the services end to end. It's about getting that positive and effective interchange between providers. It's about being able to rapidly identify as a service integrator what's inhibiting performance and service delivery. One example that we did hear about, which was quite interesting, was an integrator in a health service who identified that their staff and the service providers didn't seem to be aware of the impact of some of the non-available services from a user's point of view. They started a customer experience program. So all existing and new staff started to integrate within the customer environment, and they had a program of events that allowed the staff to go and visit and meet with users actually in their workplaces. So think about the hospitals and the doctors, and they started to understand how the users use those services and what it felt like when the services weren't available. And it's actually quite interesting because the experience visits had a profound and long-lasting effect and resulted in quite sustained improvements in terms of positive attitudes, behaviours and cultures. The staff were actually visibly upset when they realised the actual impact of non-available services. And so it really helped to change that viewpoint in terms of how the adoption to the new model was embraced.
Unfortunately, for all the good examples, there are also some bad examples. And one of the things to look at is at the plan and build of process models. Because we need to realize that within a SIAM model, process models work slightly different. We're not so much focused on the activities that each provider have to perform, rather on the outcome that they have to achieve. And what can happen here is a lack of trust between various service providers, and sometimes also including the service integrator, particularly if this is an external integrator in there. So there is a case in the professional body of knowledge that talks about an external service integrator that was newly appointed and basically requested all service providers to submit copies of their ITIL processes, role descriptions, and performance metrics, but didn't really give any context to why it was needed. So the service providers kind of got their back up and refused because they considered the service integrator to be a competitor in the market and their processes to be commercial in confidence. And because of this animosity that created, it took an additional 10 weeks for any trust to develop and for the service providers to work with the service integrator in creating process models that would work end-to-end across the various providers in there. So if this project had the appropriate governance to handle with some of these commercial sensitivities, and if they had used some organizational change management, this challenge and the delay in the project could have been easily avoided. As I said, we do need to realize that the plan and build stage is not a one activity that you do. There may be several integrations or iterations that happen. For instance, initially the customer may design a SIAM model and then appoint an external service integrator to go through a second iteration of the plan and build. But it can even be possible to return to discovery and strategy stage of the roadmap and reiterate some of the high-level strategies, governance, or the reporting framework before providing additional plan and build detail.
Okay, so sooner or later, hopefully you get to the point where you're time for your implementation. The objective of this stage within the roadmap is to transition from the organisation's as-is current state to that to-be desired future state, which is essentially the SIAM model. Now, at this stage, we want the new SIAM model to be put in place and ready to be used. And it's triggered when the organisation completes all of the activities in strategy and design and the plan and build stages. So the timing for the start of implement can be influenced by all kinds of events. For example, we could start because we have the end of an existing service provider's contract. It could well be that an existing service provider ceases to trade, or it could be that the organisational structure changes due to maybe corporate or restructural takeover force us to move into this next stage. Quite often, the customer organisation has limited control about the timing of some of these events. It may actually need to react to them by completing as many of the discovery and strategy and plan and build activities as possible. And this can mean an increased level of risk because they might not actually have enough time to move on based on some of these external factors. So let's just start by looking at selecting an implementation approach. When we move to or agree on an approach for understanding a transition to a service to a SIAM model, there needs to be a consideration of the specific associated factors impacting the customer. So additional thought really needs to be given to the identified risks that could impact and affect the move to the SIAM ecosystem. Now, there are two possible approaches to implementation: big bang and phased. The big bang implementation is one where we introduce everything at the same time. So think about the integrator, the providers, the new contracts, the new way of working. The nice thing is it gives us an approach that will help us to have a clean break from all those legacy issues and behaviours. And at the same time, it gives us the opportunity to avoid some of the complexities associated with a phased approach. But it can be high risk because it affects the organisation at one time and the risks need to be carefully managed. And often, you know, we might do a big bang because we have to based on some of the things I mentioned earlier, things such as a major reorganisation or a contract end. So most organisations who adopt the SIAM model introduce it into an environment where they already have existing providers and contracts and relationships. So that means that the big bang option isn't available to them. So the second approach is the phased implementation, probably more common. This is where we go in through iterations, and you might do that different ways. It could be one provider at a time, one service at a time, one location at a time, and so on. So it can have lower risks, but the risks can be extended through the transitional period. So we have to have and give specific care and think about the impacts of that transition approach in terms of how it impacts on the existing services within the organisation. I'll go back to what I mentioned before about organisational change management, absolutely imperative here to help us to manage sort of course corrections and so on, and also to help us, to get our organisation, our teams, able to handle agile iteration of activities from the previous stages.
So in implement stage, we do the actual move to the SIAM ecosystem, which means there's a lot of onboarding and offboarding activities of various service providers in there, and it can be a particularly tough time for the people. So one of the examples of a professional body of knowledge talks about a British multinational insurance company, which took over another company in the UK, who was originally wholly insourced. But because of the global nature of the merged company, they decided to outsource and move to a SIAM model with a service integrator who was based in India. So that means that a lot of the internal staff could either move to India or would be out of a job. And no one really wanted to move that way. But what this organization did as part of the transition, that they invited the existing staff to actually go over to India and to help with the new service integrator, transitioning the service and understand the organization. And they were quite rewarded for that, as well as, of course, having an overseas job in there. And the thing about this is that this really helped the staff to be motivated and to stay motivated throughout the transition. And although they were unhappy losing their job, they acknowledged that the company did the right thing by them, and they kept giving a favorable reference to the previous employee, which retained some of their reputation in the UK market.
Okay, so this is where the rubber really hits the road. Staff will be moving in and out of the organisation, and it can be a disconcerting time. So again, thinking about examples where things haven't gone according to plan. Most organisations, or certainly most countries, have legislation around staff displacement. So in the UK, for example, we have the TUPE rules, which is the transfer of undertakings, protection of employment regulations. And one example we did see, which shows some of the possible people challenges, was where an outgoing service provider, in order to avoid having their staff transition to a new provider who was in fact a competitor, moved their staff onto other accounts. So this did mean that they were unable to meet their service requirement and they were penalised under the contract. But for them, this was less of a loss compared to losing their staff. So whether the customer saw this that way could be completely different, but what it did mean was that they were able to retain the staff that they wanted to retain and not have them transition over to the new service provider. So this period is a little bit awkward for everyone, and certainly something that we need to think about. I've also talked about, very much being focused on making sure that people move to the model and they don't slip down into old ways of working. And really, again, I keep going back to this, manage through project management, manage through using your organizational change management, and really think about making sure that you implement the services successfully so that within that running stage, things are going to work according to plan.
Okay, so once the transition is over, we move into the final stage of the SIAM roadmap, which is run and improve. But things aren't quite clear here either. If you're doing a staged or a phased implementation, that means that run and improve is already running for some services or some providers, whereas other ones are still being added. And of course, a SIAM model is not ever stable. There's always flex of new providers, renewal of contracts and upgrades in there. So there's constant reiteration between plan and build, transition, and the run and improve here. One of the key elements here is having the structural elements in place. So these are things like boards that perform the governance. We have process forums that can work for the proactive and innovative cross-provider development, and then we have some working groups that can deal with ad hoc issues and things, again, from a cross-provider point of view in there. And it's very important to get that collaboration and cross-provider work happening in there. So when a process forum, we talk on things like continual service improvement or a problem management forum. Working groups are like major incident teams and things like that. We also have to have a good look at the measurement and reporting in there. And here is where the service integrator has to pull together all those individual provider performances against the contract, but then also provide some kind of report of the value in there. You can measure performance easily, but getting that true end-to-end SIAM value report, that is not easy at all.
Okay, so moving into some of the examples then. In Run and Improve, this is essentially about keeping the lights on. So think about that day-to-day delivery. So this is about managing the end-to-end process activities in the teams. It's about measuring the performance that Simon talked about there. It's about fostering a culture of collaboration and managing ongoing improvement. So looking at some of the good practice examples in the body of knowledge, if you think about the role of the service integrator, managing those service providers, it has similarities to a family. So parents, the service integrator, need to be quite firm with their children, who are the service providers, but not too authoritative. Instead, we want to be guiding and directing and being fair to all of the children or service providers equally. So trust here is not solely based on age and position, do what I tell you because I said so, but it's based on a long-term relationship that proves to be beneficial. And what we need is a situation where the providers and the integrator are working together in a give or take situation, so we're going to get those optimal benefits for the family to be achieved. Another point that I'd like to make is about impartiality. Now, I mentioned the word before. For the service integrator, control and governance within a SIAM ecosystem can be, recognised by the term poacher turned gamekeeper. Now, that term originates from a recognition that some of the best gamekeepers inherently know the tricks of the poacher's trade. Now, this might not be an analogy that the service providers would enjoy, but it does create a useful comparison to reflect the service integrator's role in the effective management of the providers. Because by understanding the challenges and strategies and approaches adopted by the suppliers or the providers, so that the integrator can effectively grease the wheels of interoperability at the provider's level without stifling the providers too much. So the customer support here is very, very important too, because if the customer doesn't endorse and fully communicate the integrator's role, the integrator is going to have some real challenges establishing the required authority to allow them to govern and manage. Key to success here in the SIAM model with the role of the integrator is complete impartiality. So it doesn't matter who's performing it. I talked about the different layers or the different levels of integration that could be done there. And I've used the term impartial, which isn't necessarily independent. When we talk about impartiality, we're talking about even-handedness. So what we need to make sure is that the integrator is seen as acting without bias or prejudice in terms of the providers that are in the model, so that everybody is being dealt with in exactly the same way. So we need that fairness from the integrator layer. Otherwise, we're going to have some challenges with them being able to really do their role.
When it comes to bad examples in run and improve, I guess most people will just have to look around in their organizations. But there are a few things that could be avoided. And one of the highlights that we have in the SIAM body of knowledge is that collaboration that we need for things to work in a SIAM ecosystem. And while we all know about the stick and the carrot, hopefully we also know that you catch more bees with honey, and that rewards work better when it comes to ingraining and improving desirable work practices. So there is a case to be made for the service integrator to call out good behaviors from individual providers and individual employees, and hopefully have things like social programs, even things like employee or provider of the month, to keep working on that innovation and that collaboration across. The other thing that I want to highlight is the reporting and the fact that you need both quantitative but also qualitative measures in there, which is again looking beyond what's easy. Quantitative measures can be easier, they can be put in a contract, you can measure them, but they're not always as the way that the service is perceived. So it's really important to look at some qualitative measures that again the service integrator and the customer can achieve to see if there really is a benefit to your SIAM model in there. Remember that SIAM is not a tightly structured contract environment. It really needs to be a collaborative way of working together.
Okay, thanks, Simon. So look, some of the takeaways from their presentation today. The first one is around customer value, and that's why the customer wants to move to a SIAM ecosystem. SIAM can actually improve relationships and collaboration within a complex multi-provider model, and that's something that most of us today are used to. SIAM acknowledges and focuses on the specific challenges that are experienced by customers within this type of multi-sourced environment. It provides governance. It acts as the voice of the customer, and it essentially allows the customer to focus on their core business, but only when it's well planned, with effective strategy and proper service design. Now, this is a real imperative if the customer wants to benefit from the loose coupling that Simon mentioned before, which is the ability to be able to scale up and scale down the services and move providers in and out of that SIAM ecosystem. SIAM really allows us to focus on outcomes over activities across the service providers. So if there's a clear understanding of the business outcomes that are required, these can be translated into and linked into the service outcomes and targets, and then turn to the performance indicators of the individual providers, allowing them to focus on those and not the minutiae of the processes, the activities, or the individual contract targets. A really good example from the SIAM professional BOK is from an airline in Australia who gave the IT department on-time performance as a key business performance target. Because after all, failing on time targets is costing the company significant money. Now, of course, IT isn't involved in a lot of elements that would come to be analysed when we look at on-time performance. There are other factors as well. So the catering truck could break down, it could have a flat tyre, the airport could run out of fuel. But by focusing everyone on this simple business outcome, it allowed the SIAM ecosystem and the people within it to prioritise incidents, determine risk of making changes, and discuss improvements across the dozens of service providers.
Another takeaway that we want to implore on you is to make sure you design a robust SIAM model, establishing the service integrator as the customer's agent, even if, or maybe even especially, if the integrator is outsourced. And so SIAM is that organizational capability to manage and integrate multiple service providers, and the organization of that capability needs to be very clearly defined. So external models or hybrid models or the lead supplier models, the structural elements of the boards and the process for them, you really need to start with that discovery and strategy and a very clear plan and build. Now, I just referenced those structural elements. They are really key to have a successful SIAM ecosystem. Just putting people together and expect them to manage by contracts is not what SIAM is about and unlikely to yield rewards. Now, while it ultimately requires evolving contracts in there, really fostering the one team culture, having that outcome focused and that collaboration focused, having people work together in the boards and the process forums and working groups is one of the key outcomes of a SIAM model. Now, we're getting towards the end of here, and luckily for you, it's not that hard to get further information around SIAM. There is not one, but two bodies of knowledge, so the foundation and the professional. These are available as a free download, but you can also get them in hard copy from Van Haren Publishing if you like to hold a book, thumb the pages, write notes in the market in there. So the professional body of knowledge extends the theory of the foundation and provides a lot of those good and bad examples. We also see training and accreditation available for both foundation and professional level through EXIN, BCS, and now also APMG. And there's a lot of different formats in there. There's online courses, there's classroom-based courses, and if I can just toot our horn for a moment, we use a flipped classroom concept, and we also have invented some quite creative gaming concepts where we use something we call Siamese and some other games to really enforce the concept of the SIAM model in there. There are an enormous amount of blogs and white papers out there regarding SIAM and the approaches to it, and there are more and more special service management SIAM conferences. Some of them you might have to travel for, so in India, but there's also the SIAM North in Manchester later on this year in November. And especially for this particular seminar, Van Haren has sponsored us, and it's giving away the free SIAM Foundation Study Guide just for this week. So there's a rather complicated URL here that you have to go to, so quickly read it, but I'm sure that this seminar will be provided for you, and there's a code there. If you use Go SIAM, then you can get the Foundation Study Guide for free. You can also go to a slightly easier URL to siam.vanharen.net, and there you can see all the publications that are available, so the bodies of knowledge, the different study guides, and also the different courseware in there. And that brings us to the end of this particular seminar or webinar. If there are a few questions, Simone, I don't know if there's any we want to run past now.
Yeah, there are loads of questions, but we will handle just one question, and the rest will be answered in email directly after this conversation. There's a question from Jeroen Schalkwijk. He's asking on the SIAM ecosystem. What are your thoughts on having the contract between the service integrator in a lead supplier model and the external supplier? Would this be a viable solution or option?
So if I repeat the question, so having the contracts directly with the integrator is kind of going against the SIAM model. We want the integrator to be independent and impartial. And so if the integrator has a contract with only one or two providers, and in a lead supplier that may even another section of the own business, that could potentially cause some skewed relationship with the other providers in there. So from an outstart, I'd say that is not something that I would recommend. However, of course, with a lead supplier model, there is a closer relation between the integrator and the provider of that same organization. So there could be a commercial benefit to have that relation formalized in a contract. But it would have to be a reasonable, significant benefit in terms of efficiency to do that, because we really want that integrator to have that impartial role.
All right. Thank you very much. Yeah, we've come at the end of the webinar. I really would like to thank Michelle and Simon for this great content, the great webinar. And as said, everybody will receive an email with the recorded link and with the questions and the answers you have posed today. So thank you very much.